I wasn't looking for anything, just sorting through unpaid utility bills, when I found it. One line, my mother's cursive, let Derek stay. Ilara is not to come back. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, though the room was still. The ink had bled, just a little at the edges, water damage maybe, or time. I stared at it so long my tea went cold beside me. The letter hadn't been addressed to me, clearly not meant to be seen, but there it was, tucked behind an envelope marked Bellwood Utilities, left behind in a pile of mail my mother had forwarded to the old apartment, just in case you ever need something from home, as if home was still something I had a key to. My mother used to say I was too sensitive, always reading into things, always imagining subtext where there was none. I heard her voice now as if she were standing in the room, disapproving of my posture, my career choices, the worn flannel I still wore from college. And now, it seemed, she disapproved of my existence near the house entirely. Outside, the October sky was falling into twilight. A street lamp flickered inconsistently, throwing golden light across the dusty hardwood of my apartment floor. Below, the bookstore's sign creaked as it shifted in the wind. I had lived above that store for nearly 5 years now. The smell of old paper and cedar was oddly comforting, better than anything Bellwood had offered me in a long time. I pushed the bills aside and picked up the letter again. It was folded once, neatly, the way my mother folded everything: napkins, thoughts, truths. Let Derek stay. Alara's not to come back. Not, Alara shouldn't, or we wish she wouldn't, but is not. It sounded like an eviction of the soul. I set the letter down beside the typewriter, an old Smith Corona my father gave me when I turned 16. He'd said, if you're going to tell stories, make the words count. He died 3 years after that. I had carried the machine with me through 4 apartments and across 2 states. Sometimes, when the apartment got too quiet, I typed just to hear the keys click. Tonight I didn't touch it. Instead, I got up and filled the kettle. The stovetop took a minute to catch. The chamomile tea was a blend I bought in bulk from the co-op downtown, the same scent Grandma Holloway used to brew when I couldn't sleep. Back then, I thought the warmth of her mug could fix anything. Now, I knew better, but I still made the tea. While the water boiled, I sat at the edge of my couch, feet tucked beneath me. I reached for a framed photograph I kept on the shelf, me, 10 years younger, standing with a tool belt and paint on my jeans in front of a half-built porch. The house in Bellwood. My hands had helped frame the front windows. I'd drawn the first draft of the plans on graph paper in this very apartment. The siding had been my idea, sage green. So it looks like it belongs to the trees, I'd said. No one mentioned it again after construction was done, like the effort disappeared with the scaffolding. I remember the final day of building, late November, just before the first snow. Derek had shown up late, holding coffee for himself and no one else. I'd been there since dawn, laying the last deck boards in silence while my father's breathing grew shallower inside. He died that winter, and the house, it seemed, began to forget. I took out my phone and opened the camera. The letter, now smudged where my thumb had lingered too long, glared back at me. I snapped a photo, filed it in a folder I'd named Proof of Small Things, a folder filled with screenshots, photos of invoices, blueprints with my initials in the corners, things that no one else had acknowledged but I couldn't let vanish. I lit a match and dropped it into the fireplace. Then the letter. It curled slowly, resisting, before folding in on itself and blackening into nothing. The apartment dimmed as evening thickened. I stood by the window, watching the bookstore owner lock up, his scarf flapping in the wind. He waved without looking up. I waved back. From the drawer, I pulled out a pencil and my calendar. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks away. They'd be gathering. The house would be warm with food and chatter and the hum of football in the background, and I was not to come back. I circle Thanksgiving weekend on her calendar and whispers, let's see what they've turned it into. The porch still creaked when I stepped on it, but this time nobody came to open the door. The sound brought back too much, a hammer swinging, paint drying in the crisp autumn air, my father nodding approval without words. The memory curled around me like mist, even as the front door remained firmly closed. Bellwood had changed, and it hadn't. The maples that used to blaze with color had mostly shed their leaves now, leaving spindly gray limbs reaching toward the cold sky. The gutters on the house were clogged, and a few leaves had gathered in the corners of the porch. The sage green siding had dulled. The front step I once installed by hand had a visible crack down the side. I knocked, then waited, pressing my hands into the pockets of my wool coat. A moment later, the door creaked open about 6 inches. Derek's face appeared behind the screen. His hair was longer than I remembered, and his jaw had the scruff of someone who'd stopped caring just enough. He didn't step outside. "Why are you here?" I looked him in the eye. "Thought I'd see how the house was doing." He gave a short laugh, dry, not amused. "Still standing. Doesn't need checking." "I wasn't checking," I said quietly. "Just remembering." He tilted his head. "You're good at that. Romanticizing things you bailed on." My jaw tightened. "I didn't bail, Derek." "You left, didn't you?" His voice was clipped. "Right when things got hard. That's kind of your pattern, Alara." I wanted to say something sharp, something clean and final, but the words tangled, the way they always did when he used that tone, the one that sounded like he had all the facts and I was just noise. "I helped build this place," I said instead. "You know I did." He shrugged. "Sure, so did Dad. So did a dozen guys from the hardware store. Doesn't mean you get to claim it." "I don't want to claim it," I replied. "I just wanted to see it. I used to live here too." He leaned on the edge of the doorframe. "You've got a whole new life now, don't you? Montpelier and bookstores and whatever. So why are you back here playing the past?" From inside, I heard movement. My mother's voice, muffled, probably asking who was at the door. She didn't come out. Didn't say my name. I opened my mouth to speak, but Derek cut me off. "Mom said not to make this a thing. She's tired. You showing up. It's not helpful." I nodded once, stiffly. "Right. Wouldn't want to disturb anything." Before I could say more, the door closed. This time, the sound wasn't soft. I stood there a moment longer, then stepped down from the porch. The creak followed me again, like an echo that wouldn't let go. On the way back toward town, I passed Willa's diner. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside. A garland of artificial leaves wound around the front door. I hadn't planned to stop, but something in me needed something familiar, even if I wasn't sure it would be. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. The smell of cinnamon and coffee hit first, followed by butter and something yeasty. Behind the counter, Willa Martin, same silver bun, same floral apron, looked up from her pot of soup. "Well, I'll be," she said, squinting for a moment. "Alara Holloway." I smiled, surprised by how easily it came. "Hi, Willa." She rounded the counter, wiping her hands on a towel. "Lord, I haven't seen you in, what, 8, 9 years? Sit down. You want the booth near the radiator, don't you? You always liked it warm." I nodded and took the spot she pointed to. The seat cracked a little under me, but the heat felt good against my back. Willa brought me coffee before I asked. "Still take it with cream, no sugar? You remember that? I've been pouring coffee longer than some marriages last. Now what brings you back to Bellwood?" I hesitated. "Just passing through." She gave me a look that said she didn't buy it, but didn't push. "Well, passing through or not, your pie's on the house today. Pumpkin's fresh. I baked it myself at 5 a.m. Didn't even burn the crust this time." She slid a slice in front of me a moment later, steaming slightly, the scent hitting something soft inside me. I ate slowly, listening to the quiet clink of forks and murmurs from the other booths. A few people glanced my way, nodding, uncertain if they recognized me, or just the outline of someone who used to be familiar. When I stepped back outside, the wind had picked up. I pulled my coat tighter and turned to head toward my car. That's when I heard it, low and gravelly, from across the street. "Miss Alara, got a minute?" I turned. Mr. Hal Cranford stood beside his picket fence, wool cap pulled low, coat buttoned wrong. His old beagle, Rudy, sat beside him, tail thumping slowly. The dog barked once when he saw me, the kind of bark that wasn't warning, just memory. Hal was leaning slightly on a rake as if pretending he'd been out there all along. "I've kept some things," he said. voice steady despite the breeze. I think you should see them. Hal poured strong tea into mismatched mugs. They all told me not to meddle, but I kept records, Alara. Some things shouldn't be erased. The warmth of the mug felt heavier than it should have, like holding something equal parts comfort and confession. The tea was constant comment, orange peel and spice, the kind my grandmother used to brew when the power flickered out during winter storms. I took a sip. It tasted like a memory. Hal's living room was exactly as I remembered it. The lace curtains hadn't changed, and the small lamp by the bookshelf still had the fringed shade I used to find oddly elegant as a child. A fire cracked in the hearth, throwing gentle light across the photographs lining the mantel, most of them black and white. His late wife smiled from several, frozen mid-laugh in one. Her absence was present in every corner of the room. "You never really left," Hal said, settling into the chair across from me. "Not up here, anyway." He tapped his temple. I smiled faintly. "Doesn't feel that way." He took a slow sip from his own mug, then leaned forward to reach under the end table. With some effort, he pulled out an old green ledger, the spine faded and paper edges curled from years of handling. "This," he said, setting it on the coffee table between us, "is the old construction fund log your father asked me to keep when he got sick. He didn't trust Derek to balance a checkbook, and he didn't want Margaret touching it." I leaned forward, heart beginning to thud, not with hope exactly, but anticipation. Hal flipped the ledger open with care, the pages rustling softly. The ink was brown with age, handwritten in a tidy script. He stopped halfway through, pressing one knuckle into the page to flatten it. "There," he said, sliding it closer to me. March 12, 2013. Transfer from E. Holloway, $42,500, noted as Foundation Fund, Siding, Electrical Prepay. Your father signed off on it 2 lines down. I stared at it. My name, spelled correctly. My contribution, recorded. "They said it was a gift," I said quietly. Later, said it didn't count because I walked away. Hal's eyes softened. "They rewrote it to fit their version of events. But I saw you showing up at 6 a.m. to measure beams. Saw you come back on your day off to fix that misaligned window in the laundry room. I just wanted to help. And you did," he said firmly. "But folks like your brother and your mama, they mistake silence for absence. You never needed a stage. That doesn't mean your part wasn't real." I blinked hard. The heat behind my eyes surprised me. I hadn't cried over any of this in years. It felt like touching a wound I'd told myself had already healed, only to find it still raw underneath. Hal reached again, this time pulling out a folded paper from the back cover, a receipt from a materials supplier in my name, my initials scrawled in the bottom corner, a copy of the transfer confirmation. "I've kept these things," he said, "because truth has a habit of disappearing if nobody keeps a backup." I smiled through the blur in my vision. "My dad used to say a memory fades, paper remembers." "He was right," Hal said softly. "Smart man." We sat in silence for a while, sipping tea. Outside, the wind tapped lightly at the old window panes, a hollow rhythm like a patient knock. "You know," Hal said after a long pause, "you don't have to try to re-enter their house to prove anything. Some doors, they shut for a reason. You're better off building your own." I looked at him. "You really think so?" He nodded. "You can't go back to what was, but you can build what's next." His dog Rudy snored softly on the rug near the fire, paws twitching in a dream. The clock ticked on the mantel. I hadn't felt this calm in years. When I stood to leave, Hal handed me the ledger photocopy and the receipt in a manila folder. "Just in case," he said. The wind was sharper outside, the sky shading toward early dusk even though it wasn't yet 4. I thanked Hal again and walked to my car with the folder pressed tight to my chest. That night back in Montpelier, I brewed another mug of tea and sat by the window. The lights below flickered on, one by one, in the apartment across the street. I could see the bookstore owner sweeping up for the night. A couple excitedly held hands, one of them pointing up at the few leaves still clinging to the trees. I turned on my laptop. The screen lit up and the cursor blinked in a blank search field. I hesitated for only a second, then began to type, "City of Bellwood, Business Licensing Department." I scrolled until I found the permit application. Under business name, I entered Community Workshop Studio. I opened her laptop that night and began a permit application. New business, community workshop studio. There it was, bright yellow, taped crookedly to the front door. Foreclosure notice. Vacate by December 1st. It stopped me cold. I hadn't planned to walk this way. I was just coming back from a property a few blocks down, an old feed store near the railroad that Sarah thought might work for the studio. But my feet had wandered, the way memories do. And then there it was, the house, the porch, the notice. I stood across the street for a long minute, not sure what exactly I felt. Vindication, pity, nothing neat enough to name. The house looked the same, tired, stubborn. The siding had dulled, more since my last visit. The gutters still hadn't been cleared. The only thing new was that awful yellow square flapping at the edges. Hal's voice echoed in my mind. Funny how truth and karma both knock when no one expects them. I crossed slowly, my boots crunching through leaves slick with morning rain. The smell of wet earth and chimney smoke settled into my coat. I paused at the bottom step. The porch creaked when I stepped on it, just as it always had. But this time it sounded less like memory and more like warning. The door opened before I knocked. Derek stood there. Same tired sweatshirt, same defensive shoulders. He followed my eyes to the notice. "You saw it, huh?" "I wasn't looking for it." "Sure." His voice was thin. "No one ever is." I waited, letting the silence stretch. He finally muttered, "It's temporary." "That's not what the paper says." His jaw tightened. "It's a banking thing. We're working on it." I looked him in the eye. "Are you?" He didn't answer. From deeper in the house, I heard the scrape of a chair and the soft click of heels on hardwood. A moment later, my mother appeared in the doorway behind Derek. Her face was thinner than I remembered, though her lipstick was the same pink she always wore when I came. "Alara," she said carefully, "I wasn't expecting—" "You never are," I said. A flicker of something passed through her eyes, but she composed herself quickly. "Would you like to come in?" I raised an eyebrow. "That's new." She glanced at Derek, then stepped aside. I hesitated, then followed them in. The air inside smelled like lemon cleaner and something burnt. Maybe toast, maybe nerves. The living room was too warm. A gas fireplace hummed under a flat-screen TV that hadn't been there when I left. Margaret sat on the edge of the couch like a guest in her own home. Derek stayed standing, arms crossed. "It's not as bad as it looks." "You said that about your last 3 jobs," I replied. "Alara," my mother warned gently. I looked at her. "You want to talk about this? Fine, let's talk." She straightened her shoulders. "We know things have been strained, and perhaps we didn't always recognize your contributions. But this is serious. The bank's been breathing down Derek's neck for weeks. He tried to handle it alone." Derek shifted, uncomfortable. "We thought we could refinance," she went on. "But with your father gone, and with the economy, well, the house isn't in both names anymore." My stomach turned. "You signed it over to Derek?" "He needed security," she said. "A foundation." "I was the one who laid the actual foundation," I said, voice low. No one spoke. I took a breath, trying to stay level. "You shut me out. Literally. You told me not to come back. But now that things are falling apart, you remember I exist." Margaret reached for my hand, but I stepped back. "When I was paying for roofing supplies and siding, I didn't get invited to Thanksgiving. When I covered that electrician's deposit, no one wrote me a thank you note. But now you want me to help save the house." Derek finally said, "You have money, don't you? From that little job in Montpelier?" I laughed. "You mean the job I kept while you burned through 3 promotions and a refinance loan?" He looked away. I turned to my mother. "You once said I chose the hard way, and you were right. I did. I chose dignity. I chose distance. And I chose not to owe my life to people who only love me when they need something." She wrung her hands, eyes watery now. "But this is your brother." "When I helped quietly, I wasn't family," I said. "Now that I'm useful, I am?" The room fell into a hush, so thick I could hear the fireplace kick off. I took a step toward the door, already pulling my coat tighter. Margaret's voice followed me, softer than I'd ever heard it. "Are you really going to let your brother lose his home?" I didn't answer. The rain had started again, soft and steady. I opened my umbrella, stepped out into the cold, and let the door close behind me. Sarah handed me the keys to a dusty old warehouse and said, "It's not pretty, but I know you'll make it beautiful." The keys were cold in my palm, the weight of them somehow heavier than I expected. The building loomed behind her, half forgotten and sun-bleached, its metal siding weathered by decades of Vermont wind and frost. One of the windows had a crack spidering across it like a frozen lightning bolt. Still standing there in the slanted gold light of a late November afternoon, it felt like a beginning. "It has good bones," I murmured almost to myself. Sarah laughed. "You sound like your dad." I smiled, a real one this time. He would have loved this mess. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust, rust, and something sweetly damp, like apples left too long in a wooden crate. Dust motes danced through the beams of light spilling in from the high windows. The place was empty, save for an old shelving unit and a sagging metal stool in the corner. But I could already see it. Work tables lining one wall, a reading corner with old armchairs by the windows, a community board filled with flyers and sketches and dreams. When Sarah left, I stayed behind. Just me and the echoes. I opened a few windows, swept a patch of floor with the back of my boot, and dropped my coat onto a crate that would become, for now, my desk. A few minutes later, I heard hesitant footsteps outside. He was maybe 14, lanky, with a backpack slung too low over one shoulder and a hoodie 2 sizes too big. He lingered by the open bay door, pretending not to be curious. "You lost?" I called gently. He shook his head. "Nah, I saw you come in. Just didn't know anyone bought this place." "I haven't yet," I said. "Just rentin'. For now." He stepped inside slowly, like someone entering a room in a dream. "You like drawing?" I asked. He looked startled. "How'd you know?" I gestured to the sketchbook poking out from his hoodie pocket. He flushed, then pulled it out, flipping to a page halfway through. It was a pencil sketch of the warehouse, rough but thoughtful. The lines knew what they wanted. I whistled softly. "You have an eye." He shrugged, but I could tell the compliment landed somewhere deep. "I'm Alara," I said. "This place is going to be a workshop for makers, artists, kids with ideas. You want to help me clean it up? I pay for pizza." He grinned. "I'm Micah." We spent the next hour sweeping out cobwebs, gathering scrap metal, and debating the merits of deep dish versus thin crust. He told me his school didn't have an art program anymore. Budget cuts. I told him that was a crime, and I meant it. Later that afternoon, Hal appeared with a cardboard box in his arms. "These," he said, nudging it toward me with his foot, "were my tools. Some still work, some just remind me of building things." Inside were wood chisels, a tape measure with his initials on it, a level worn smooth from decades of use. I lifted a hammer and felt the weight of trust more than steel. "I can't accept this," I said. "You already did," he replied, winking. Word spread faster than I thought it would. The next morning, Willa showed up with a thermos of hot cider and a stack of mismatched folding chairs. "You'll need seating," she said, "for the ideas and the folks having them." By day 3, the place didn't look new, but it looked claimed. I printed out the photo that had lived for years in a shoebox at the back of my closet. Me, 26, in overalls and dirt-smudged cheeks, leaning against a beam frame of what would become our old family house. My dad's arm draped over my shoulder, hammer in his free hand. I pinned it to the bulletin board near the entrance. Below it, I wrote in thick black marker, "The first home I built. This one is next." I stepped back, breathing in the must and promise and dust. The sun had shifted lower in the sky now, casting long amber streaks across the concrete floor. Micah stood beside me, holding a half-eaten slice of pizza. "You really built that?" he asked, pointing at the photo. I nodded. "Every nail." He was quiet for a beat. "Cool." I turned to grab my phone and snap a picture of the moment. The photo on the wall, the boy beside it, the light like a blessing. Just then, the screen lit up. Derek. "Can I talk to you? Alone?" "I'm not here to ask for money," Derek said, hands in his pockets. "I'm here because I don't know who I am without that house." His voice didn't have the edge it used to. It came out quieter, like it had been worn down by the wind. We were standing just inside the workshop, the smell of cinnamon sticks drifting from the small corner kitchen Sarah had helped me set up, with a donated kettle and a tray of mugs. It was warm inside, partly from the electric heater humming at our feet, partly from the energy of things finally taking shape. The walls were still rough, shelves only half full, but it already felt lived in, cared for. Derek looked around like he didn't know where to put his eyes. He kept glancing at the community board, at the folding chairs arranged for the weekend's reading circle, at the oversized chalkboard where Micah had drawn a sketch of what our little library nook might someday become. I didn't expect it to feel. He stopped. Like it belongs to someone? I offered. He nodded slowly. Yeah. I poured tea into two mismatched mugs, mine in a faded red ceramic one, his in a blue enamel camping cup. I slid it across the table. He took it, but didn't drink. You know, I said, sitting down, I didn't build this place to prove anything. He didn't look at me. You don't have to say that. I do, because it's true. I leaned back. I built it because I needed to. Because not being welcome back doesn't mean you stop wanting to create something worth coming home to. He finally took a sip of the tea, made a face. Still hate cloves. I smiled despite myself. Still don't care. That got a short laugh from him, the kind we hadn't shared in years. He set the mug down. I messed up. I didn't speak. He kept going. I wanted to be the one who held it together, the house, Mom, everything. I thought if I just handled it, no one would notice how lost I was. I watched him. When you left, he continued, I thought it meant I had to become you, the one who fixed things, but I'm not good at fixing anything. Not like you. You don't have to be like me, I said quietly. You just have to be honest about who you are. The heater kicked on again. Outside, snow had started to fall, light flakes tumbling like scattered feathers against the window. My phone buzzed on the table. Mom, I let it ring. Derek glanced at the screen, then back at me. She's trying, you know. I know, I said. But trying now isn't the same. He nodded. I get that. Micah wandered in from the back, his hoodie dusted with flour from the makeshift bake sale we were hosting later that day. He carried a drawing rolled under one arm, his face bright. Miss Alara, look! He unfurled the paper with dramatic flair. It was a floor plan for a future kids area, labeled shelves, a cozy beanbag corner, even a tiny puppet stage. I leaned forward, touched one of the pencil lines. You did all this? He beamed. I figured maybe someday we'd let the little ones do story time. You said this was for makers. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not pain exactly. Something softer. Maybe gratitude. I love it, I said. Micah grinned, then disappeared again, with the distracted urgency only teenagers possess. Derek looked at me. He's lucky to have you. I didn't answer. I just sipped my tea and let the warmth settle in my hands. My phone buzzed again, voicemail this time. Later, after Derek left, I stepped into the quiet office space in the back and played it. Mom's voice, tentative, soft. If you're opening the studio this Thursday, I'd like to come. If that's still okay. She didn't say sorry, she didn't beg, but the tone, the one she used when I broke my wrist as a kid and she sat with me all night, was there. I texted back, if you're coming to see me, not to fix me, the door's open. I sat for a moment after pressing send, staring at the screen. Then I stood, walked to the entrance, and flipped the sign to open. Some things break quietly, like trust, like old windows in November, but kindness has a way of slipping through the cracks. I never planned on building anything more than distance, but somewhere between the blueprints and broken boards, I found something sturdier than walls, grace. It turns out when you stop chasing approval and start offering space, people show up not because they must, but because they want to. Like a porch light left on in the dark, quiet generosity can guide even the most lost hearts home. And maybe that's what real shelter looks like after all.